I'm going to be talking about basically a cross-sector overview of standards and basically how standards are converging. So despite the fact that this is actually I should say because this is a news industry organization, I'm going to focus on sectors that are not news because I think that's an important part of the message that I want to convey is how essential it is as these standards develop and evolve that they be cross-sector because we live in a very, very interoperable world. Evan, I will just tantalize you with the title of his talk and say no more about it. It's The Future of the Past. Evan is from the New York Times, as I think you know. And last but not least, Kim Svensson. Kim is director of Stibo Accelerator and also vice president of marketing for CCI. And he's going to be talking about innovations and trends in the news and where smartwatches fit in. So while Evan is going to be focusing on the past, Kim will bring us the future. So obviously, it's no news to anybody here that we live in an interconnected world. And obviously what happens is when you've got all this interconnection, you suddenly have interdependence between all these parties in this interconnected world. And that's not a bad thing. It means you don't have to start from scratch when you're developing standards and building technologies. So unlike the world of 50 years ago that Stefan was just characterizing, where it was actually quite competitive, and a sector was trying to say, we need to control our environment. We're living in an ecosystem now where we can't control our environment, and we need to interoperate with everybody else. So the new mandate is interoperability, which enables systems and processes to operate smoothly and predictably. It removes friction. It results in efficiency and economy and flexibility. It's also about reliability. Things need to just work. You have to be able to access content between various systems, various devices, et cetera, without doing lots of convoluted transformations. Content needs to be portability. I don't need to belabor this point. Every speaker pretty much has emphasized this point about the importance of mobile. And adaptability. As new developments happen, you should be able to take advantage of those new developments seamlessly without being kind of trapped in a proprietary technology or an out-of-date standard that isn't keeping up with what the rest of the world is doing. So this is the longest of my slides. I apologize. But building on that, the interconnectedness leads to interdependence, which requires interoperability. What that means is that these standards start to converge, and the organizations that are responsible for these various standards need to start collaborating. I happen to participate in a lot of, I spend an inordinate amount of my time in unpaid, thanks to my Apex, my employer that gives me the leeway to do this, I probably spend half my time in various standards bodies and committees and working groups and things in various publishing sectors. And one thing that keeps becoming very obvious to me is that Sector A is busily reinventing a wheel that Sector B has a good solution to already, and they're completely unaware of it. So the idea here is to just spread the knowledge. And to give a little shout out to our sponsor, the message of my sermon is not to get as much to get you to pay attention to what the other sectors are doing, but to get the other sectors to pay attention to what IPTC is doing. Because IPTC is actually way ahead on a lot of these standards, has a lot that all publishing can benefit from. So obviously I'm getting at multidimensional collaboration, but also cross-sector collaboration, global collaboration. It's all of these working groups that virtually all of these working groups that I'm on are international participations. It's hell to organize the times for the conference calls because there's people all over the world that have to be on these calls. And another important principle is basing standards on other standards. That's something that I see a real increasing trend to, where instead of building a new monolithic standard from scratch, people are saying, well, wait a minute, for this aspect of what we're trying to do, let's align with what these other folks over here are already doing. And so I'm going to give you some examples. And again, some of these will strike you as, what do these things have to do with the news industry? Well, I hope you'll see. So I'm going to give you two extreme cases. The one on the left is a scholarly journal, Proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences in the US. And the one on the right is a textbook from Cambridge University Press. This is my slide of why news people should care about these things. You get stuff from those guys and you sell stuff to those guys. So I'm going to start with the journal, which is a simple, single sector example, a very important problem in the scholarly journal field that was very quickly solved. The issue is, now that there are open access journals, there are what are called hybrid journals, which have some articles are open access, some are behind the paywall. And the systems in that ecosystem did not make it obvious whether a given article was free to read or not, whether it was open or not. So the solution that the industry came up with was called ALI, Access and License Indicators. It's an ISO recommendation. And it consists of only two metadata elements. It is super simple. It is dead simple. It's got one element that says free to read, yes or no. It's binary. It has two attributes, start date and an end date, so that you can have an embargo and you can have an expiration to when the free rights expire. But that's all that element's about. And you've got another element that provides a stable URI for where the licensing terms can be obtained. That's all it is. It's simple and it works. And by the way, one psychological thing that they did is that they never used the term open access. It's almost as charged a term as DRM, which is an acronym I try never to say, and I just did. So please forget that I said that. Because these become religious arguments. So they just said, no, we're not going to try to define what we mean by open access. We're just saying free to read or not free to read. So why was that so easy to do? It was done in months. Well, first of all, it's a very homogeneous ecosystem in the scholarly journal area. All these journals provide their access online. The vast majority of them by about 3 or 4 main hosting services. There are established support systems throughout the industry. Crossref is an inter-article, inter-publisher linking system that basically registers millions and millions. Basically, every scholarly article is registered with Crossref and provides interlinking between them. Also, they're only concerned with the article, so they're dealing with a well-defined chunk of stuff. It's a journal article. They're not thinking about the components of the article, so more on that in a minute. And they all use the same XML model, which now called JATS, was called NLM. And they have a big metadata header that's part of that, and they all use it. So there's an example of an extremely sector-specific solution, but we can learn from that. The strategy of try to avoid over-politicized terms. Try to make something just very simple to implement, and it was done almost instantly. Well, here's the opposite example of a very complex situation. This is, again, not a news example, but you'll see why it relates to the news. First of all, I should say that most textbook publishers and all the big ones really don't think in terms of books anymore. They think in terms of platform. And so this is an English language text from Cambridge for an English literature course. But it could have a video from Condé Nast. It could have an interview from the BBC. It could have photos licensed from Getty. It could have that article from the scholarly journal. It could have a commissioned illustration from an artist. It could quote something from a trade book. The teacher creates content. Students can create content, et cetera. All that kind of stuff is in a publication like this. And what rights did they obtain for all those assets? And what formats are those assets provided in? All the lists that I gave you on the previous slide. And what metadata came with them? And do any of those assets have assets embedded in them? And there are then embedded rights in there. The problem is that these assets are all from different sectors, and the sectors treat these issues in different ways. So it's not interoperable right now. The file formats may all be different. They may not just plug in like you want them to do. They don't all use the same rights metadata. Hardly any of it is machine readable. I gave you the example from the journals. Well, the reason that works for journals is that the hosting platform provides the ability for you to click on that URI and it'll tell you what the rights are. But guess what? A person needs to read the rights. Well, if you're doing this, clearing the rights for your textbook platform, that works, or for a library that's hosting all of Springer's journals, for example, it works. But if you're a news organization, you've got a fire hose of content coming out. You cannot depend on somebody having to read the paper or the text about the content. It has to be machine readable. And a big platform like this has hundreds or even thousands of these assets from all different sectors. So this is a true mess. So this is why we need this multi-sector collaboration. So I'm going to just give you a quick whirlwind tour through what's happening in some of these standards groups in some of these other organizations, or some of these other sectors, excuse me. The book industry focuses on authors and agents. So they're really all about royalty tracking, and it's a nightmare for those people, but they're thinking of it at the title level, and it's how many books did I sell, and what do we have to pay the author for this, and the people that are the worst victims are the agents of the authors who have to report this information to the authors, and they're now getting cacophonous information from all the different retailers, from Amazon, from Apple, from Google, et cetera. It's different from all of them, and it's a nightmare to manage. They've created a huge controlled vocabulary, very rich, very modular, very structured. So while the focus on rights and, on royalties and author royalty reporting is pretty specific to that book industry, the trade book industry. The fact that they've got this really rich vocabulary is worth looking at for other organizations or other sectors that are trying to deal with rights. They've also got a payment spec, very complicated model. I'm going to zip through this because I have a limited amount of time to speak here. There's an organization called Editor that governs a lot of standards internationally in the publishing space. The controlled vocabulary I just described to you is based on an Editor standard called Onyx, which is the supply chain metadata standard for the book, retail book industry. They also have one for publication licenses and one for information services. Most people in other sectors don't even know this exists, and it's incredibly rich. Lots of good stuff in there. Here's one that's getting closer to home now, ODRL, the Open Digital Rights Language. Now, this is actually a framework for transmitting machine-readable rights metadata. It's from the W3C, expresses policy types, actions, constraints, parties and roles, relations in machine-readable form. And the first thing when I start talking to people in the standard space about this is they say, well, wait a minute, this is actually just from a community group in the W3C, so it's not really a real web standard, which has to go on what's called a rec track or recommendation track in the W3C to become, there'll be an actual working group and it'll become an actual recommendation. Well, not quite, but stay tuned. It is on the verge of getting on a rec track. The message that I want to send to this group is that while any organization or anybody can belong to a community group, but what they produce isn't, quote, an official W3C recommendation. Once it gets on a rec track, the working group is composed of members of the W3C, and hardly anybody from the publishing side of the world is a member of the W3C. Most of the organizations that you represent, you guys sitting in the room right now, are big organizations, big important organizations that live and die by these web standards. I really urge you to see if you can manage to join the W3C. I'm not representing the W3C, I'm not selling W3C. My worry is that these standards get developed without your input when this kind of thing happens. So it's really important to get a seat at the table. So anyway, it is being used, which is actually the best test of a standard. It's, are there implementations? Does it work? So IPTC writes ML. It's a profile of ODRL, expressed as XML or as RDF or as JSON. Very good thing. So the magazine sector doesn't have something like this, but they're now looking at using ODRL and modeling what IPTC has done as part of the solution for the magazine industry. Now, I have a colleague from the magazine industry who's sitting here, who's probably more up to date than I am on exactly what the ID Alliance's thinking is on this. But my hope is that we can keep them on track for aligning with IPTC's modeling an implementation, not necessarily using it whole hog, but at least aligning with it so that we don't end up with forking standards here, because there's so much joint common interest between the news industry and the magazine industry. Photo industry, the PLUS Coalition is a really great example. If there's any organization that for years has involved lots of other standards groups and organizations, it's this group. IPTC, the Link Content Coalition, ODRL, ISNI, which is International Standard Name Identifier, IDER, which is a DOI-based identification scheme in the entertainment industry. ID Alliance is the magazine industry group. All of those groups participate in and have contributed to this PLUS Coalition's work. And of course, as you know, IPTC photo metadata is the dominant metadata model in that industry. So what do all these things have in common? It's the open web platform. It's web technologies, web services. This is really the context of this convergence that we're seeing. And that's where we get the interoperability. So, and I particularly when I stress web standards, I immediately have to point out to people that I'm not just talking about your website. The infrastructure that you've got in your publishing operations, the structure and semantics you use in your content, how you render the content in all media, how you deliver your content in all formats, how people discover and how you disseminate your content, how you repurpose your content. All of these things are now being done with web standards-based technologies. The shorthand is now to refer to it as HTML5, which really is, in a sense, a constellation of about 100 different specs: XML, HTML, CSS, SVG, and scores of others. HTML5 formally is the structure of the content, CSS3 is the styling, and JavaScript is how the functionality happens. These really are the nexus of this converging set of standards away from proprietary standards like Flash, for example, to use HTML5 video, not Flash, et cetera. A lot of you have probably spent a lot of money migrating a lot of video content or animation content from Flash to HTML5. The idea is to get it in a standards space where it's stable and it can evolve as the standards evolve. Something that this sector doesn't probably participate much in is EPUB 3, which is thought of as the ebook standard. And I always have to point out to people, the name is EPUB, not ebook. It's about any kind of publication. And it's packaged web content, basically. It's for packaging and interchanging complex publications and documents. And again, it's based on web standards. It's free, it's open, it's non-proprietary. And so, but it's not the same as what you've got on the web. It's not identical to what you've got on the web. Wouldn't it be great if there wasn't any difference? Well, that's what's being worked on right now. Its current name as of 2 weeks ago is PWP, a portable web publication. The idea here is that it's one file for a publication that works exactly the same, whether online or offline, whether packaged or not packaged, whether cached or not cached. It's one publication that works everywhere. So the IDPF, which is the International Digital Publishing Forum, they govern the EPUB standard. W3C governs the web standards. These two organizations are really working hand in hand right now to try to move their specifications closer and closer into alignment. So then I hear people say, well, wait a minute, if everything's going mobile, that's all about apps, right? So do I really care about the web anymore? You know, how important are browsers? Well, the point is, the apps are based on these same technologies. So the message is making your content agnostic as to the mode of delivery by using these standards and by helping to make the standards line up so that they work together in a fully interoperable way. So, you know, if you think about EPUB, it's packaged, it's very predictable, it's very highly engineered. The whole idea is it's got a whole bunch of files, it's got a bunch of fonts, it's got videos, it's got audios, it's got scripts, it's got style sheets, it's got metadata. All that is wrapped up in one package, and people think it's a file because it says .epub. Well, you open up that file, and it's all that stuff, but it's organized and documented what it all is. So that makes it really easy for a reading system to know exactly what they're going to get. In fact, I mentioned the educational publishers. Many of them are now moving, including Cambridge, are moving to using the EPUB profile, EPUB spec of the HTML standards and the EduPub, I won't get into that, educational profile of EPUB, not as much as a delivery mode, but as an architecture for their platforms and for their repositories. HTML, that's like an all-terrain vehicle. It goes anywhere, it goes everywhere, but it's very undisciplined. In fact, I talked to XML people, which most of your organizations are XML dominated. They're very skeptical of HTML. You have to realize that HTML5 is all about semantics, and if you express it with what's called the XML serialization, XHTML5, it can be every bit as rigorous as any other XML model. And so, yes, apps are important. They're like in between, right? They're very fast, very efficient, very modern. Yes, they stay on the roads, but they don't need tracks like the trains do, right? So lots of roads. So the whole point is, under the hood, they all use the same technologies. And I guess I'm here to report that the good news is this is really, it's been happening, but it's really accelerating now, and we're starting to see benefits from it. So thanks very much.